You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
I just saw a graphic showing Pro Tour number 1, and someone saying Pro Tour 1 is basically a living legend format because 200 plus of the decks played at PT1 and now living legend, Brendan. Isn't that an interesting stat for you?
Well, it's pretty interesting too when you think towards San Jose and Worlds. Not only Briar, very likely to be living legend, but specifically Rosetta Thorn, which is going to have a massive impact on Viserai as well. I think we're already seeing the ripples of this potential future meta in the recent Battle Hardened, which we're going to talk about, where we saw no aggro decks actually in the top 8. So I'm not too sure if it's a little early for the narrative to have turned the corner so quick, but we'll dive into it, I'm sure.
Well, guess what the fourth most played deck at Pro Tour number 1 was, Brendan. Just cast your mind back.
The fourth most played deck. So we had Briar, Viserai, Prism, and then
no PT1 you had Bravo, Chain, and Prism.
Yep, and then the fourth most played deck, I would say Briar, right?
Yep, Briar. So maybe it reads like a list of living legend. Anyway, welcome back to Arsenal Pass, episode 74. Today, Brendan and I are diving into the mailbag. We've got a lot of questions from Twitter, from Discord, from all you listeners out there to get into. But first, Brendan, how's your week been in Flesh and Blood? Have you been playing any Flesh and Blood?
Yeah, I've been playing a lot. So I was actually planning on taking like a multi-month break after PT2, but just been playing a lot of Flesh and Blood online whenever I have downtime, specifically in the morning, because I just usually have a few hours before I go out. I'm currently in Prague right now, which has been awesome. Just a beautiful city. But yeah, playing a lot of Flesh and Blood just here and there at night in my bed on my iPad in the morning, queuing into random people. Like I've had the opportunity to play with Sasha plenty of times, but we often will opt to sort of two-headed giant in the public matches rather than just play against each other for now. Just has been a lot more helpful, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. Like I said, was planning to take a very long break, and the software and the usability and the just being able to spark up a game whenever has sort of reignited my passion for playing the game. But yeah, I've been playing a lot of Kano.
Nice, fair enough. Yeah, I've seen some of your games you've shared, so back on the Kano grind. Yep.
Yeah. What about you?
Not much Flesh and Blood. Played a couple of games here and there, but I'm working at the moment. About to head back to Australia on, I think, the day this drops, so straight to Nationals. So a little bit undercooked, underprepared, but have had some time to sort of reflect on post PT and what the meta kind of looks like, and just kind of taking a theory approach to what we might do for Nationals. So that's coming up pretty quickly this weekend.
Yeah, I'm actually interested to know, to hear kind of what you think the meta does look like, because I know we talked last week, of course, but I remember Dalen Mack posted a tweet, which I think is pretty correct. And he's like, I've never seen so many people care so much about a Battle Hardened top 8. And yeah, I mean, seems like people have really taken this recent top 8 in Columbus, which hosted no aggro decks, all control decks, pretty seriously. And I think it's actually going to have quite an impact on the Nationals meta, if Twitter has anything to say about it, at least.
Well, let's get straight into that, because I guess that's kind of top of the news anyway. We'll jump into the news and talk about Battle Hardened Columbus. So if you're unaware, there was the first post, ban and suspended announcement event, basically, with Prism gone, was this Battle Hardened in Columbus, where, yeah, you're right, Brendan, no aggro decks featured in the top 8. So I believe it was 3 Ultim, 2 Dramai, 2 Icelander, and
1 Dash.
Is it Dash? So it was 1 aggro deck, right? There's 1 Dash, but there's no Rune Blades.
Dash, I believe.
I think it was I saw the list. I think it was a hybrid. It's pretty similar to what people, pretty similar, basically the same list people were playing at the PT from what I could see. I think it was pretty similar to the Team Dragon Shield list. So, pretty interesting to see that. Well, I guess, what are your kind of takeaways on this? I have some thoughts on this, but you kind of already started. So what are your thoughts on this event and this meta, and what does this change heading into Nationals?
Yeah, so, obviously, I think Twitter kind of lied to me then regarding the dash deck. I mean, it definitely has transformational sideboard. Probably didn't play just boost aggro into all those control decks. Has this sort of secondary game plan of setting up items, and dash has been known to have somewhat inevitability, I guess, in the old days against a lot of the control decks because it would set up those items and come in with so many pistol attacks with the double purifiers, stuff like that. But that being said, no Briar, no Viscerai. I don't think that the case is closed on Briar and Viscerai in this format. I still think that Briar has like a favorable matchup into most of the decks in that top 8, specifically Dromai and Oldhim. Maybe the Icelander matchup is a little bit harder, but most of the Icelander sort of aficionados I know mention that Briar is like actually quite a hard matchup, even though theoretically you're kind of countering them. They just get one window with Channel Heroic and you just die, period. Oldhim, on the other hand, we tested that. I think it's still favorable into Briar. Druid mentioned on Twitter the additions to Hypothermia in that deck, which may have not been there in Pro Tour number 2. But I still think that, Briar has a pretty reasonable game plan into Oldhim going towards the late game, especially if you have a better late game package with Tomorrow's and maybe an attack action to sort of retuck on the deck, the pseudo drone effect via Evergreen, something like that. I think that while the results are important and you should definitely be taking them seriously if you're going to be playing nationals either this weekend or in the coming weeks. I don't think that this is the final note on aggro's over. It's just a control format. Those days are gone. I think there's going to be a lot of Briar at these national events.
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty funny, the kind of response to this battle hardened top 8. I think you're right. Like you said, never has so many cared about one battle hardened top 8. But I mean, it's the first event we've had post Prism, right? And the kind of narrative was Prism's a format balancer once Prism goes, and who's checking the control decks. Well, I think if you look at the, ninth place was Fi. I know Ethan Van Sant came ninth on Fi, so missing on literally, breakers, same points as those on 8th, because it was quite a long tail. The other thing as well is that this is a battle hardened where it's 6 rounds. Take one loss early, you're out of the event. So I think it's really hard to have a really representative top 8 personally in this format of the battle hardened. I think that's a different kind of discussion, is that I think these battle hardened events, and so in Singapore the battle hardened was 8 rounds. Same
in Texas, by the way. In Dallas it was blitz, so that makes more sense. But
was CC in Singapore. Yeah,
it needs to be like that, to be fair. I know that the time is kind of annoying, but the battle hardens that are just 6 rounds, where it's like, if you lose any round except like the second to last round or the last round, you just immediately out and you just drop. No fun. The blitz one was, you could go X2, I believe, and you still had to lose a bit late, but feels way better.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense. So I'd like to see that kind of looked at, 120 players plus, and you're playing 6 rounds, like you say. So lose second to last round maybe, but probably need to lose the last round at most is pretty tough prospect. So I think that does skew kind of some of the data a little bit as well. And then it's a reaction to Prism Living Legend. I think it's going to take a while for people to work out with these more aggressive strategies or more proactive strategies, I would say, how they actually want to, or how they should be playing into decks like Icelander, decks like Oldhim, and then of course decks like something like Dromai kind of does a bit of a replacement job of Prism, right, in this meta, where it kind of comes into to maybe do what Prism was trying to do. Yeah, to try and look after effectively these more controlling decks. So it will be really interesting. Nationals, I guess, moving on next into the new Nationals weekend kicks off this coming Saturday. So we're going to see the first lot of Nationals. I believe, of course, Australia, my Nationals this weekend, but there's also France. There's a few other national championships around the world, and then we kind of roll through for the next few weeks, eventually ending in the last week with US and New Zealand nationals and a few other nationals. So it's going to be a pretty big 3 weeks of flesh and blood, and I think we're going to see just how this format develops. The interesting thing for me is that I think the format is going to really probably settle after these 3 weeks as we head towards Worlds, and then we're going to have a really clear picture of what the Worlds meta might look like, or what the decks to target are, and likely we could have Briar Living Legend. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, because you look at, you do need to take some weight of these battle hardened results and understand that the meta is different to what we saw in PT2. But it just seems still somewhat likely that we'll see Briar Living Legend not far off. I think it works out to be sort of like 3 big nationals, 2 small ones. So it's still quite a few events to win for Briar Living Legend.
Yeah, for sure. There was one thing I wanted to bring up here. It was just a random tweet by Legend Story Studios on the FabTCG Twitter account. They just wrote hashtag Fab to Brazil. That's it. So I don't know what that means, but probably means we have a tournament in Brazil. I don't know if it's going to be a calling or whatever, but it's pretty cool. I think that's our first venture into South America. I'm not sure if the game is actually supported down there at the moment. But probably means that it is going to be. I don't know if Fab to Brazil means that we're actually, now that I think about it, I don't know if it means there's going to be a tournament or they're going to start having like a, I don't know, a region manager. Yeah, like a region manager, OP, like stuff like that. It's probably the latter, to be honest, but maybe they'll kick it off with a tournament. That would be pretty cool.
I think it's the latter. But it's a very big TCG market, especially in Brazil. So not surprised, and that's great. I know there's been a few really big advocates who want to get Fab into South America, so I'm sure they're going to be super happy with this.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, well, we see, I guess what we see next thing is Portuguese printing of the history packs, I guess, is the potential as well.
I hope so. I love the history packs. That's kind of my new way. It's been my way, I guess, since whiteboarders were a thing, but that's how I foil out my deck, since I don't think the foils are competitively viable anymore. You just get the different languages, the German ones are hilarious, by the way. I played some Team Sealed, like we mentioned the other week. And then you get your
high speed impact.
Oh yeah, high speed impact. That one's a mouthful. That one's a mouthful. You get that with the whiteboarders. The whiteboarders are officially the new cold foil, since you really shouldn't be playing with those in the deck. But anyway, Hayden, I know we're just going to quick shout out to the Arsenal Pass Patreon. The support helps us immensely. We've got some content coming your way in preparation for Nationals, in preparation for the World Championships here. The first one is going to be a deck tech, an Oldhim deck tech with the sort of Oldhim master, in my opinion. And like I mentioned, or I think I mentioned on Twitter, he does get my vote currently for best Fab player in the world. That's going to be Michael Hamilton. So he's going to be coming on to Arsenal Pass, doing an Oldhim deck tech and doing a little additional sideboard guide and write-up for the Patreon. So check that out if you are a patron. And if you're interested in that, feel free to subscribe and get some of that content.
Yep, definitely. And last thing, actually, Brendan, is just want to call out, we do have some more information on Dynasty, officially releasing November 11th. And we do get a first look at the kind of the product fact sheet, some more art with the Emperor, and we saw a card. We saw this Crown of Dominion. I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at this, Brendan.
Yeah, I have. So by equipping it, which I'm assuming is just starting with it, you immediately create the gold token, and I think that gold tokens are pretty strong. Whatever Royal is, the subtext of Royal and how it affects the other cards that are printed in Dynasty, we are yet to see. I think it's really cool right now that I think the set has like a lot of flavor already, right? We've gotten a dual class. We got the Warrior Wizard. Now we have this additional Royal, I don't know if you would call it a subtext, supertext, subclass, I don't know, whatever it is, that gets added onto your hero. And then we've seen gold tokens. We've had these copper tokens forever, these very inefficient ways to draw cards, but finally gold token, pay 2, draw a card. Sounds like the kind of card I want to have in my deck, not gonna lie. Yep.
And we do have a bit of a backstory on the Emperor as well that you can go and check out on fabtcg.com. You can learn more about the Emperor, Drakaya Vasir, and of course we do finally have a way to get rid of those pesky frost hexes if you are playing as the Emperor. Well, it's a generic, isn't it? This piece that we've seen so far.
Yeah, which is kind of a bummer.
Imperial.
Well, I was just gonna say, recently dipping my toes in the Icelander, it's quite nice just being able to set up frost hexes on some of these control decks, and they literally can't do anything about it. I'm gonna miss that.
Yeah, it is a legendary, the Imperial Warhorn. So if you haven't seen Imperial Warhorn, it's a generic action item, a majestic that's legendary. So you can only have one in your deck anyway. Cost 2. It says action 1 red, destroy Imperial Warhorn. Choose any number of heroes. Each of them chooses an ally or an item or landmark permanent they control, and then destroy each of the permanents chosen this way. And if you're a royal instead, you choose the permanents. So if you're playing as the Emperor, you can make sure that frost hex disappears or that library or whatever you want it to be. Otherwise, if you're not royal, then maybe they get to play a time snap potion or an epot to try and blank your Imperial Warhorn. We'll see. We'll see if how much impact this card has.
Yeah. It's just really hard to tell right now, but it looks like a fun tool for potential combo decks and potential degenerate formats, maybe as a way to help mitigate against those. Nevertheless, Hayden, I am in Czechia right now. I think that the Czech Republic was officially renamed to Czechia, and that's like how it's written on a map. But my guide told me not to pronounce it as Czechia because it sounds like Chechnya, and he said Czechia. He actually gave me the fist. He gave me I said Czechia, and he's like gave me the fist. I was like, oh, okay. So I'm there now. The diet is pretty interesting. It is just a bunch of meat and beer. I think the Czech Republic does consume more beer than maybe any other country in the world. Definitely more than Germany, who gets the rap for it. So beer is very popular here, but with any good beer comes some meat on that barbie. I don't know if they grill out here, but the Command and Cookout is pretty good. Been loving the food. Finally able to eat food that sustains me as a human being. There's very stark difference from over there in Lille. But with that, Hayden, let's head into the Command and Cookout section this week, which is actually the entire episode because we are heading into the mailbag.
Yeah, I do just want to... Great intro. I do just want to call out as well, if you want to get questions in for future Command and Cookout sections, you can do so by emailing us at arsenalpassfab@gmail.com, dropping a question in Discord. We actually had a question on the YouTube comments last week, which we're going to add into this mailbag. You can also do that, drop a question in the YouTube comments, call out that's a Command and Cookout question, or you can DM us on Twitter or tweet at us, and we'll get those questions in. But Brendan, I'm going to throw it to you and let you lead through these great questions that you've curated for the mailbag episode this week.
Yeah, so this one I think is pretty. We're going to start off with a few meta ones, and I think this first question is it's still fresh in our minds because it was very relevant for PT number 2. So it's from I'm a Bunny, and this comes from Discord, I believe. Could have came from Twitter as well. Discord, Twitter, kind of lumped them together when I was sifting through the questions. But it's when building for an unknown meta due to a new set release or impactful ban restricted update, usually the latter. How would you approach testing an event with a short lead time? Would you stick to a comfort pick or make a call and jam testing in a short time based on what you expect the meta to shift to?
Great question. I mean, this is kind of what I'm faced with right now, actually, with, less than 2 weeks between PT2 and my nationals. I guess it's a little bit different for me in this instance because I can't even test as I would like to, but I can answer in that, and then I'll give a more, general answer and then see what you think, Brendan. But I think in this instance, I'm probably taking a bit of a mixed approach to what, what's the name? I'm a Bunny, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So a bit of comfort, right? Like I feel like if I'm not able to test much, I need to know what the hero is going to do. I need to be able to make sure that I know lines and play patterns. Otherwise, it's going to lead to a lot of trouble. It's going to lead to suboptimal plays. It's going to lead to, even if I kind of have a great idea of how this deck or this hero might attack the meta, if I don't know how to play it, it's not really going to serve me and serve the job of attacking the meta the way it should anyway. So I think in a short lead time, I'm probably looking for something, depending on how short the lead time is, if it's a week, 2 weeks, and there's minimal testing time, then I'm looking for a mix of comfort and something that can, shift to attack the meta in a certain way. Now, if I maybe extrapolate that a little bit and say that I was in an ideal world right now between PT number 2 and nationals, where I get to test, a few hours a day, get a few sort of reps in, then I'm going to shift more towards the idea of this idea of how to attack what I think the meta is going to shift to. So, if we look at maybe the Columbus Battle Hardened, we look at this idea that we're shifting to a more of control meta. Prism is not there to check those decks. That's the kind of narrative, and I agree. I think that's how it's kind of moving. Then, that's the kind of thing I'm looking to target. How can I find the best deck into control decks, but can also have great game to Briar and Viserai and Dash. Those are the kind of things I'm looking to do. So I think it's kind of like it's not a black or white. I think it's like a sliding scale, and I think comfort is important because you need to understand how to play these heroes, how to play the lines, what your game plans actually are. You have to have a deep understanding of that. I think you can't just pick something up sort of pretty raw unless you have a long time to test it. So if we get it, say between the ban suspended announcement and PT1, right? I think we had 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. Then I'm leaning away from comfort, right? Because I have time to actually pick these up. But yeah, as we get closer and closer, the sliding scale moves away from meta pick to comfort pick.
Yep. So, I'm just gonna kind of zoom out a bit and go from just pure theory. So I know when like Sasha and I are approaching a new meta, the way we like the decks we're looking for something that is so broken that it actually kind of doesn't care about the meta, which is very unlikely, right? But below that, and definitely ahead of sort of comfort and just sort of your stock standard jack of all trades is a deck that targets the meta, which can be very hard to do, especially with the ban restricted announcements kind of being as variable as they are. It can shift very quickly, and it's just, it's been really tough recently. Prism specifically showing up in as much as it did to PT2 probably could have been predicted based off PT1 sort of attendance, but in the context of that meta, didn't make as much sense. I know a lot of people brought decks that had sort of bad matchups in the Prism and were surprised. Nevertheless, we do want to be picking decks that do sort of target the meta, surprise players, and put players in a position where they are uncomfortable, right? Either under-tested or just kind of completely ignorant of what your deck is actually trying to accomplish. It leads to a much better tournament experience. Obviously, the sort of pre-prep and work and luck that goes into finding a deck like that is not going to land you with that deck every single time. So that's what we try to go to. So if we don't find that, which is, it's very possible, I think that a comfort pick it's an interesting way to put it, right? So I would never go to the Pro Tour number 2 and obviously Pablo Pintor top 8ing on Viserai, but I would have never picked Viserai. I would have never gone to Pro Tour 2 and been on Viserai, right? I think the Viserai is seen as potentially more consistent than Briar, maybe has a cleaner matchup spread, less like bad matchups. I guess maybe it's better into Ice Lexi and stuff like that. But I just thought that the deck was fundamentally less powerful than Briar. But I was more comfortable on it, right? I feel like Briar with Spellbound Creepers and with some of the more interesting things you can do with things like Amulet of Earth can be a bit tricky to play. And I did feel like we were under-repped, which I'll get into later. But there was pretty much no situation where I was going to pick what I thought was sort of the default good deck of the format, which I thought was Viserai. So as a result, we did end up on Briar, which I do think is a bit of a comfort pick, right? We didn't end up on like Oldhim or anything like that. So Briar was a deck that we've played a lot. Obviously, we brought it to US Nationals in the form of Earth Briar, played Zero Cross Lightning Briar on the calling the following day. Both of us, I think, pretty much all three of us missed out on breakers for top 8 with Dante making top 8. So we had a lot of experience on the deck. Nevertheless, we went into that tournament, and because we were crunching in the short period of time, all of us were under-repped, and I believe we all suffered for that to an extent. I know that, looking back retrospectively, there's a lot of matches that didn't feel like we were lost because of the lack of reps, but I think that all of us were uncomfortable on that deck, which is something that we're definitely going to fix for the future, and I think was a mistake. So to answer your question, I will consistently try to audible to a deck that, targets the meta, tries to predict the meta shift. Ideally, you're doing that months in advance where you're testing for multiple metas, even if it's very loosely. You have decks. It's like, okay, we expect this card to maybe be banned, so Stubby Hammer's a little broken, so we can kind of test as if this is broken. Same thing with Scalata, stuff like that. And, just kind of be ready. But I think that last... like that week leading up to a major event like a Pro Tour Worlds, I think should be almost exclusively just reps and game plans. Like I want the list to be 90+% locked in before that week, because when you're considering changing heroes in the last week or changing, archetypes like we did from Earth Briar, taller Briar to sort of this more Zero Cross Briar, I just think that it's really hard to stay disciplined with your time, and things kind of fall through your fingers really quickly, and you end up being under-repped and uncomfortable going into the tournament.
Yeah, I don't think the last week is the time to be learning gameplay patterns and learning, these quite surface level things about a hero. So I agree on that. That's why I think this would say about the sliding scale of comfort picks. I also think when you talked about Viserai as a great example, I'm slightly different to you, Brendan. I think I would have been perfectly happy to have played Viserai at the pit. I mean, not perfectly happy. I wouldn't have been stoked about it, but I was pretty close to just falling back on Viserai because
dual format as well, right? Does that? Sorry to interrupt, but I want to ask that question before you kind of go into that. But did the dual format influence that at all? Were you like, am I more comfortable being on sort of maybe a less powerful average deck because it isn't just a strictly class constructed format?
I think the opposite, actually. I Yeah, I felt like I wanted to play Brian more into this format because of just draft, and I felt like it'd be really hard to 5-1 or EXO draft, basically. So I felt like I needed a deck that maybe had, maybe sacrificed a few more matchups, but just was more powerful in general. That's probably why I didn't fall back to Viserai. Had this been a 14 rounds of Classic Constructed, I think I very likely might have just played Viserai and just taken my matchup spread and felt really good about the list I had in my pocket, to be honest.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense too when you say it like that. So it's kind of interesting how you can talk yourself in. Yeah, you can talk yourself into kind of both ways. But yeah, I think that it's really interesting that we have the two different ways of approaching it to an extent. But I think like from zoom out like a couple weeks or even a couple months, I think we both have the same idea of like what the
100%.
perfect process is, right? We maybe don't execute it every time, but like we have an idea. It's like we want to get our deck like sorted, because I believe that reps and specifically like pattern recognition is extremely important for these long form tournaments when you're playing against some of the best players in the world and you're not going to be taking things back. You don't want to be losing games to silly mistakes or just pure ignorance on some card interactions. That stuff is very avoidable.
Yeah, you just miss stuff that you should already be across just from knowing the hero. Yeah, I think I think as a group actually in our testing so far for the first two PTs, we've all kind of started in the same place, and then maybe we deviate a little bit. We usually end up back at the same place about midway, and then maybe there's a little more deviation, and then generally kind of towards the end we usually at least on like parallel paths, if not the same paths, in terms of the way that we're thinking about the format and working towards attacking the format. Like you said earlier, it's always about trying to, I guess, ignore the format in the first place and then attack the format and then kind of play in with the format is like the last thing you want to be doing, but is often sometimes what you have to do.
Yeah. All right. So next up, we have a message from Tekla Foundry. This is from Discord. He says, what goes into meta analysis and how tiers are decided on? Is it simply deck win rate into an entire field, or is it more complicated than that? Your interpretation of the meta is usually pretty spot on, so I'd be interested to hear the process behind it. So Hayden, how do we look at a meta and decide, what is the best deck? Is it the deck that maybe has, because nowadays we can look at Fab Online and we can see decks with high win rate, right? Like we can see things like Dorinthia that has high win rate, but I think that Dorinthia is actually maybe not super well positioned. How do we sort of come to the conclusion of what the best decks are and what are potentially the best decks to be playing, right? Is it the deck with the most win rate, or something like Viserai? Maybe it has a very high win rate, but you plan to be playing into a lot of Briars who are going to be just sort of spiking you with Mount Heroic turns and things like that. I'll just let you dive into this one.
Yeah, I just want to first of all give a quick shout out to Tekla Foundry, who was a big part of the fitness challenge and has been ongoing with updating us on his journey. So just a quick shout out there. It's a really interesting question, and it's a great question, I think, because the first word that kind of stands out to me in that first sentence is tiers. How are tiers decided on? I don't really. I think tiers are kind of not a great way to look at the game, to be honest, because I think it's more about strategies and there's fluidity within what heroes can do. So I think there's like if I was to talk tier list, I wouldn't be like S, A, B, C, etc. I'd be like playable and unplayable. It's probably my tier list, I think, for any given meta, basically. So like what is competitive, what's not competitive, and maybe if you wanted to synthesize that down a little bit, you could say, okay, what is the target, then what is competitive, and then what's not competitive. Is probably how I would look at that more so. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. First of all, what goes into meta analysis? I think first of all, it starts with, what are we seeing? What is the prevailing, even if it's not necessarily what the data is 100% showing, although we'll always try and start with the data, so what's been happening from the last few events, it's actually like, what is the prevailing discourse? Like what do people believe is at the top? So, in the last meta, it's like going into PT2, Viserai was kind of talked about as like the deck to beat, right? This is the deck that was kind of, even though it wasn't showing up in the stats, it wasn't necessarily showing up in these events. It won like one of the battle hardens, but like Prism was dominating the top 8s. We're seeing like quite a lot of Briar sort of either side of that battle hardened as well. It was still Viserai that's being talked about. So it's not always about the kind of pure stats of things. And that's why when we talked about Columbus before, I was pretty quick to say that, this is one top 8, and I think the data is hard to take away from this, but what's more important is like the narrative shifting towards more of a control sort of meta. So that's kind of where it starts. It's not about Teklo asked, is it about win rate into the entire field? It's really not. It's actually, for me, it's actually a bit more qualitative than quantitative, I think, in this game, because things move quickly. There's a different level of understanding between different groups of players, between different regions. I think you have to take regionality into account when you talk about sort of data showing up. So I think the most important thing is actually understanding like what is the narrative right now heading into this metagame. And I think if you took a step back and looked at that, I think you pretty accurately would be able to predict the meta for PT2, the rise of Briar, the importance of Viscerai, Prism still being there, Ultim upticking slightly. That was literally what happened, Dash showing up like that. And if you looked at the narrative plus a bit of the data, I think you could quickly come to that sort of realization of what the meta was going to look like.
Yeah, I think I am sort of congruent with playable and unplayable rather than tiers, but there is something that supersedes that where it's like I definitely look for cards cards and interactions that are fundamentally unfair, and like that is what I really want to be putting in my deck. But this is it's pretty interesting because I feel like Flesh and Blood, at least in more recent times, has become a bit more rock, paper, scissors, right? Like a long time ago in the old days of Welcome to Wraith, you kind of had game into everything, right? No matter what you were playing. Nowadays, you do have game, but you will tend most decks, aside from what I guess you colloquially call the tier 0 decks, things like the Briar decks that showed up 4 in the top 8 of the PT, tend to have like one really bad matchup somewhere, like one potential auto loss, as some people I call. So I actually think that in Flesh and Blood, like predicting the meta and predicting what will show up is so incredibly important. And calling back to the amount of Prism that showed up at the PT, I think that you could have predicted that based off PT1, but if you just looked at these sort of quantitative data with a bit of recency bias and you looked at something like Singapore's results and what showed up at Singapore with barely any Ultims, like literally almost no Ultims, and much less Prism, I think you had a reasonable sort of sample of data to say, there might not be a lot of Prism at PT2. But what we know, regionally based, and sort of what showed up in PT1 as well, despite Chain being very powerful, is that people are going to play Prism no matter what, and people really like Prism, and it shows up in Force. And that's sort of the narrative that shined through. And I know some people that came on those decks that had really bad matchups in the Prisms and maybe had a bad gem pairing. They showed up on Oldham, they showed up on Icelander. They had a bad time, and most of the ones I spoke to expected less Prism as a result of that data. So I think in Flesh and Blood, you have playable and unplayable decks. Maybe some of those unplayable decks are playable too. You have some that are a bit, they break the math a bit, right? They might be a bit broken. They might be a little bit overpowered. But I think most importantly, you want to sort of predict what other decks are going to show up to skew the gem pairings in your favor with the highest likelihood.
Yeah, so I think it's one thing, right? So Teklo's asking about meta-analysis, which is one thing. And then the next step is, are you just going over and above that, like you talked about? So I guess or are you targeting it? Those are two different things, and that comes next. I think the interesting thing actually was while you were talking, Brendan, I just had a look. So about 2 weeks before Singapore, actually about 10 days before Singapore, the three of us, actually the four of us in total, were talking about what we expected the metagame to be. And I have a sheet that me and Sasha actually did together. We went through kind of what we expected the meta to look like. It's really, really close to what the meta ended up being, with a slight shift with Dash increasing and Bravo decreasing, which kind of happened with Singapore. So, and I think that literally came off the back of, a little bit of data, but a lot of what the discourse was and sort of discussion happening in the community. I think Twitter's a great place for this. Discord's a great place for this. And then a little bit of the stats and extrapolating to what's happening from there. So just really interesting. I think it's going to be, as we get more data in this game, it'll be interesting to see if that changes a little bit. So data becomes more important than it is right now. But also, we need more events as well. So I think just pure data from games played is not, win rate in this game doesn't correlate to results, I think, in big events because because of the complicated nature of deck lists, of game plans, etc. So I think I caution. There's a lot of discussion going on right now about the use of data and the impact of Fab Online and things like that. And I guess my kind of initial response is really so far data has not been that massively important in Flesh and Blood. But we'll see.
Yeah, it's actually it's pretty funny. If you go on Fab Online, just a small anecdote, like Dorinthia has above a 50% win rate, and Kano sitting around 30-something%. Icelander's sitting down near the 40%. Kano and Icelander, I think, are extremely powerful decks, and in the right player's hands are some of the best decks actually in the current game. But, you're going to see things like Dorinthia and Viserai have some of the highest matchup spreads because they're the easiest decks to play. Like, Spellbound Creepers, I guess, is a bit more challenging in Viserai. But Viserai, like, playing Mauve Shrill is pretty freaking easy, right? And then getting in your Revel and Runebloods, which is going to happen a lot on ladder. Playing Dorinthia, which hasn't been seen in the meta for a long time, and just kind of gotchaing your opponent with some attack reacts. Like, yeah, that's gonna be a really good quote unquote ladder deck. And the thing is like the more you adhere to what the data says on something like Fab TCG Online or something like that, and you use that to influence your picks, like you want to pick the deck with the highest win rate, the easier it is for like smaller groups of players to target you and target that meta, right? With a deck that just absolutely kind of blows that out of the water. So data's a double-edged sword, and yeah, some of the data that is currently showed on Fab TCG Online, I think is pretty funny with specifically Kano being in like the lowest win rate. Levia still below it. Sorry, man, Sam.
Still a really small data size, and also, Brendan, I've been told by a few people, can you please stop bringing the win rate of Kano down in an attempt to make it look worse? So,
yep, that's me. All right, so next up we have Mason Brantley. He said, with the recent SEG Con top 8 featuring many control decks, can you speak to the psychological difference between aggro heavy metas and control heavy metas? I've seen more intense negativity from the anticipation of the upcoming meta, being a control meta, than I remember for the year plus that aggro has dominated. Well, I'll go ahead and I guess touch on this one first. So first off, I think that the initial reaction of the community is always going to be intense. I think there was probably a time when the reaction of the community was intense towards the aggro meta, right? So things like the Viserai deck back when it could also combo pretty easily. Briar just in general. The outcry around Briar was pretty bad from what I remember. But I think that what's potentially harder about control metas is, they're probably less fun at the armory level, right? Specifically fatigue metas, because fatigue, as we've said a lot, and I know this is probably in Arsenal Passism at this point, fatigue is a strategy that's very easy to implement and very hard to beat, especially at the beginner level. So it can just absolutely terrorize armories and lead to what is seen as a very bad format. But aggro, on the other hand, sort of takes out a lot of the tenets of what makes Flesh and Blood a good game, like just raw aggro mirrors. So things like blocking, right? Blocking is a part of Flesh and Blood, but some of these aggro decks literally don't block, right? And that's, that might take out some fun for people, some dynamic gameplay. Second cycle, pitch stacking, sort of your keeping track of your threat density whatsoever. A lot of that stuff kind of falls by the wayside as you just play aggro mirror into aggro mirror. They're fun in their own way, but I think that both kinds of metas have a downside. With the upcoming quote-unquote control meta, although I don't think that that's exactly what's going to happen, it does actually look to be a pretty fun control meta. So if it was just Oldhim fatiguing people out, yeah, that would suck. But Oldhim, there's things like Dramai, another illusionist that can potentially put enough permanence on board to sort of assemble a critical mass of power to win in the late game. You have things like Dash with the weapons. I know that Guardian did get that shield for some reason, so they're in a better spot. But also Icelander for the Frost Texas. Oldhim can't do anything about Frost Texas, and that Icelander combo is actually quite good. I'm sure Oldhims are going to add, play against that, figure out some tech, and maybe make it a better matchup. But I don't think that Oldhim is the end-all be-all or fatigue is the end-all be-all that it used to be, and I think there are tools to beat it which make control meta, if that is what happens, pretty interesting. I think I would probably enjoy it more, but I might sort of eat those words. I don't know.
Iceland is, I think, actually pretty great for the game. So far, it's really interesting to me what's going to happen with a meta that has Icelander that can kind of thrive and do well. So, this might be my favorite question so far. This kind of psychological idea between aggro heavy metas and control heavy metas, because I think the aggro heavy, when you talk from a psychological difference from an aggro heavy meta, it's kind of like a race to the bottom. It's been this kind of, I think, thought process for people is like, okay, how do I have the fastest deck? How do I win a turn earlier than the other aggro decks? How do I disrupt these aggro decks? Like that's kind of the psychological standpoint is like, okay, I can go either one of two ways, right? Like I can go faster than that person, or I can go disruption. And sometimes that has led to, a more controlled route, say like ultim and trying to just like straight up fatigue the opponent or wear them down with hammer, etc. Or it's like on-hit effects that kind of force the aggro deck to then block, to slow them down, or just be straight up faster, right? That's kind of it's like that psychological standpoint. I think when you hit into a control meta, it feels a lot more complicated. It feels like I don't just have one or two or three options. It's like there's a lot more turns in the game is like one of the psychological differences. There's a lot more decision points in the game, although I don't think that's actually true. I think that's what is kind of thought of as like the psychological difference. And it's like, how do you approach this? There's so many more decision points. There's so many more turns. Like, what do I do? How do I do it? And in reality, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think if you boil it down, it's still about having a really clear game plan. So let's take, say, like the Viserai into Ultim game. I think if you're the Viserai player trying to find a route to victory, it's about setting up really important turns. It's still about 5-card hands. It's still about really important phases of the game with key cards. So say it's Mordred trying to read the runes. Say Revel and Runeblood, really important card in that matchup. So there's still really important turns and 5-card hands. And then in between that, you just have turns. You just have gameplay. And sometimes that's just blocking to preserve life. Sometimes that's trying to leak some damage with Rosetta Thorn, things like that. So I do think it can feel a bit more daunting in a control heavy meta, and I think that's maybe people's response as well. Get ready for the grind, get ready to settle in. I personally think it's a great thing. I think those are really exciting when you have to have these game plans that evolve and unfold over the course of your 60 cards, as opposed to just the kind of first 10 or 15 cards you draw mattering. I actually think that gives more agency in the game. So for me personally, from like a psychological standpoint, I'm really excited by that. Like I'm really like ready to grid in and play my whole 60 cards, as opposed to, just kind of think about the top 15 cards of my deck.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, it'll be fresh, and I think that's enough to keep. Like, it's entertaining, at least at the beginning. We've been in the aggro format for a very, very long time, and it has just gotten faster and faster and faster. And to see that maybe finally turn the corner would be nice, just for kind of a new experience. All right, hey,
so I just want to say, it's so funny. It's like this is the meta that we thought we were going to get when Ultim was first printed.
Yeah.
We thought that we were going to have this really aggressive meta that kind of got balanced by disruptive elements with decks, but the power level was just too high. Prism was in that meta to mitigate some of this. So we're seeing that shift. Will that actually play out over the long term as we head to Worlds? I don't know, but yeah, this idea of like this psychological difference, it's going to get some getting used to. This idea that you have to settle in for these games. It is about the full game plan and the full 60 cards.
Yeah. And people are always going to be pissed on Twitter. That's what Twitter's for. So I'm paraphrasing this one from Collision Point. And Hayden, I just want you to talk a little bit about obviously Briar. If Briar gets banned, Briar's a big deck. Briar's been popular for a long time. Powerful deck. Talk to me about the ban of Rosetta Thorn. What does that do for Runeblades? Like, Rosetta Thorn is just a different weapon. And you could say it's built different, 1 for 4. Runeblades having to go back to this other suite of weapons. How do you feel about that for obviously the current Runeblade being Viserai, but future Runeblades? Do you think that Rosetta Thorn was a bit above curve? Was it too powerful? And are Runeblades going to be sort of probably perpetually less powerful for a while until they get something on par with Rosetta Thorn after its ban?
So you just paraphrased a one sentence question into a whole story.
Yeah, pretty much.
classic Brendan. But no, it is a great question. So I guess what happens? So the question. Sorry, the question is what happens when Rosetta Thorn rotates out, basically, right? Like, what does that mean for the game?
For specifically Viserai initially, but for Runeblades moving forward, right? Like that weapon. Yeah. And do you think that weapon is fundamentally more powerful and sort of above curve than other?
Yeah, I mean, it is.
Yeah,
it is. It just straight up is, because it's 1 for 4 split across 2 sources. One of those sources being something that requires you to play a different set of equipment to even think about dealing with, and then depending on what the opponent does beforehand can change that sort of scenario. So it definitely is, and what it's done. The kind of big thing that Rosetta Thorn has done is this game plan or this strategy of non-attack action, attack action. Rosetta Thorn is like a really clear kind of path to leak and push damage generally. which is really interesting. So I think when Rosetta Thorn moves, we move away from that structured sort of way of needing to play a Runeblade. I think initially that's going to feel like a really massive downgrade, obviously, a lot of loss of power. But what I think it opens up long term is a really interesting design space for deck builders and for players to pioneer game plans into how they want to play into different matchups. Think of even in the initial standpoint, it's like, okay, Rosetta Thorn going means Briar's gone, which means Viserai is the sole Runeblade left. Who would have thought about that? And Nebula Blade would probably be the weapon of choice, although you do have, of course, Reaping Blade and then Dread Scythe, depending on what. Maybe the Runeblade deck looks completely different. Maybe Viserai needs to take a completely different standpoint and Dread Scythe becomes viable. I don't know. But that's going to change this kind of idea and structure, because when you have Nebula Blade, you probably still play to that game plan initially. I think people will go to that attack action, non-attack action Nebula Blade, for instance, but that's a much more resource intensive turn. You need to start looking at one cost attacks. The Shrill into Rosetta Thorn is no longer viable. It's going to maybe have to be something like Spellblade Strike into Nebula Blade, which is a much less powerful turn. So that's going to be really interesting, I think. And then I guess kind of like long term, I mean, it depends what we get from the next Runeblade. I do think that Rosetta Thorn potentially leaving in the near future is just a good thing. Although I think Rosetta Thorn helps balance out these decks that can really take the game long. So something like an Ultim, even potentially something like Dramai, because you can always force to leak damage through 5-card hands, which you potentially won't be able to do without Rosetta Thorn in the format. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also a little bit worried once Rosetta Thorn sort of rotates out, because it feels like the current format is balanced for Rosetta Thorn a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I totally agree with you, actually. But I'm interested to see what they give us in lieu of that exiting the format.
Yeah, like, do we get another Runeblade in Dynasty? Do we get something that's Rosetta Thorn-esque, but not quite? That's really interesting to see. Like an attack for 3 that has 1 arcane damage is like really interesting to me, I think, because I think that balances out Rosetta Thorn a little bit, makes it defendable with 1 card plus an extra floating resource to block the arcane. I'd be interested to see if that sort of weapon might be viable. I just want to say Collision Point did also ask about, would Scalata returning help boost Viserai? I think once you have Rosetta Thorn out of the format, a card like Scalata becomes interesting again, because you don't have necessarily the ability to potentially attack on 2 axes like those decks did, where they're just like, here's a really efficient aggro deck that also has this crazy combo. So yeah, let's see. Maybe that card can be unsuspended. Who knows?
Yeah. Also, just want to say, like, Rosetta Thorn from a theoretical perspective, I think that it's too powerful in the aggro and mid-range matchups, but I also think it's borderline necessary in control matchups. So if there was something that replaced it that was sort of more equalized in the aggro matchups, whatever constraint you would put on it, to have it achieve that, but also had that same level of power level and the ability to leak damage into the fatigue and the control decks, I think that would be the ideal weapon. I just don't see the current Runeblade suite of weapons actually doing that, so we'll probably have to get something new. All right, Hayden, this is a question. This is kind of a time-old question for Arsenal Pass. Some would even say a cliche at this point, but this is from Toma Harvest, and he says, what is the most underrated card in the Classic Constructed meta and why? And if we have time, same question for Blitz. Hayden, I can only guess what yours might be, and I think it might be a warrior card, maybe?
I think you start. I need to have a little quick think about this.
So what is the most underrated card in the current CC format? So I'm going to do kind of meta relevant, right? I think that, and let me make it easy. Let me bring it back to like PT number 2, right? Because we're seeing massive potential changes in the meta. I think the most underrated card was probably Amulet of Earth. I think that card, when I saw it, thought it kind of sucked. I don't even think that it's particularly like by itself like super powerful. I just thought that at that tournament, it was really good. I thought it was really good with Spellbound Creepers and what that deck was trying to do. And on top of that, my opponent just didn't see it on the freaking board for some reason. Not all of them, but some of them. And I experienced that in testing. The permanent of Amulet of Earth in an aggro matchup, if you have no experience playing against it, which a lot of people didn't, they would, and sometimes you can't block, you can't overblock it by 1. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't, and it sits on the board forever. So it's like that pummel that you can't play around, but it just sits there forever when someone's forced of naturing you or snatching you and doing stuff like that. I think that card is freaking gas. Blocks for 0, correct, but there's not a lot of blocking going on in that format anyway, so I thought that card was really underrated for Classic Constructed.
Um, might cop out a little bit really, and probably just say Spellbone Creepers is still underrated.
Probably, yeah. It's really, really good card. What about Unified Decree?
Yeah.
Did make the list?
You know what? It didn't, but maybe in the future. It's not the most underrated card. It's the most. It's a sleeper card, you know. The things that I do just maybe want to point out though is yellows. I think yellow cards are kind of a little bit underrated in this upcoming meta. I think about attack actions that you needed to play six power cards because of Prism and things like that. They become obviously way less relevant without Prism in the format. And I think some yellow lines over some potential red lines in your deck is like a really relevant decision to be made in this upcoming meta. So I do just want to say maybe yellows as a whole might be a little bit underrated in this kind of upcoming meta.
Mm-hmm. Honorable mention for me, after getting some experience with the deck, I think Promise of Plenty was pretty underrated. Obviously, Matt was the only one that played it. In his deck that draws like a million cards, it was pretty good. I think it's a pretty good card actually in that deck. So, and that was, I don't think anybody else played that for what it's worth. So for Blitz, Blitz, I don't know. It's probably Aether Wildfire, to be honest.
I think it's probably Fist of the First Fist.
Okay, yeah, that was definitely underrated. So yeah,
still not seeing a lot of play. People are still choosing to play Tunic in some matchups and things like that. I would just be playing Fist of the First Fist most of the time, and any deck that can efficiently present damage and be able to use those resources for any kind of solid value. It's probably either that or Goliath Gauntlet for me. It's a big 10% of someone's life is pretty big in that format. Yeah,
just getting 2 value out of your equipment, pretty easy off the Goliath Gauntlet. Okay, closing out. Coming to the last few questions, Hayden, we have a question from 1426, and he says, how do you recover when a big tournament doesn't go your way? My Lille experience was great, but some travel difficulties led to a mediocre performance in the first day of the main event. Still had a great first time at the PT, though. I'll go ahead and let you take this one, Hayden. So how do you deal with loss, disappointment, and not getting the result that you ultimately hope for?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened at Lille, really. I mean, it's hard to be... So I went 8-6 in the end, which is, it's a winning record. It's day 2. But ultimately it's not why I'm there. I just think that the best way to recover is to move on. You can't win every event. You can't top every event. Unless, maybe your name's Pablo Pinto or Michael Hamilton, I guess. But, for the majority of us, that's not attainable. So I think what you have to do is you just have to move on. I do think a reflection on the event is really important. So, for me, that's like a post-mortem on the event. What went wrong in preparation? What went wrong on the day? What would I do differently in hindsight? What would I do differently even if I ignore the event but just think about maybe better preparation? Those are things that can lead me to, I think, make better decisions in the future. At the end of the day, you can't change what happened. So the hindsight, you got to be careful of, I should have played this or I should have played that. Realistically, it's more important to think about your preparation and, had the preparation changed, would you have actually ended up on one of those decks? Or is it just, well, actually now knowing everything about the PT, this would have been the ideal deck? Because often that's just not, it's not relevant and it's not attainable to be able to think about those or to be able to do that, to be able to target a meta that you didn't know about or to have access to a list that you just were never going to have access to, for instance. So I think that's super important. And when it comes to, I guess, the actual performance on the day, I think it's really important. So after each kind of section of the event, say like the PT, so after the draft section, the constructed portion on day 1, then the draft section and the constructed portion on day 2, after each of those 4 kind of sections, I personally took some time just to reflect on what happened in those. I didn't think too hard about it. I didn't want to get myself into this headspace of dwelling on those games and heading into the next sort of round with that still in my mind. But I did make a few notes kind of in my notebook about those portions and what I think went well, what didn't go well, just to reflect on afterwards. And then sort of a couple of days later, I did reflect back on some of those and post the event on some of those things because you want to take the learnings away, but you also don't want to have that derail your event. If you start at, say, day 1, take a couple of tough losses that you feel like you could have done something different in, or had you prepared differently, you could have had a different outcome. Those are really important learnings, but also if you let those sort of be at the center of your thought process, it's not going to go well for you. You're just going to dwell on those. And at X2, on day 1, you're still massively in contention for top 8. I think we saw 3 or 4 of the players in top 8 were X2 after day 1. So it's really important to understand that don't dwell on those things, but have them as takeaways.
Yeah, I think the most important thing you can do is take it as a learning experience and use that to have a better experience next time. So if you do, if you go there, you have a bad experience, the only answer to have is, okay, that's it, right? That's what happened. Yeah, that's it. Like, there's no point in feeling bad for yourself, feeling like you got unlucky. Like, screw that. Doesn't matter, right? Like, you're either going to soldier on and go to the next tournament and learn and get better, or you're not, right? And if you're not, you're going to be like everybody else, and you're probably never going to win the tournament. Like, this thing about the card games is like, it's very skill-based, yes. And some players are arrogant enough to feel entitled to the win. So when they don't win, they feel robbed. They feel like they got unlucky. But nobody's entitled to the win. And at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. And you're going to have to probably play a lot of these tournaments. And it doesn't matter. Like, the more practice you put in, the more likely you are to win. But there might be a long period of time where it doesn't matter. You might be the hardest working player. You might try the hardest. You might sacrifice, or you might just keep losing. And yeah, you can have that conversation like, should I hang it up? Should I stop playing? But at the end of the day, you just got to look back. Even in the sentence you gave us, had some travel difficulties. Okay, next time, fix travel difficulties. Get out there earlier. Make sure everything's accommodated before. Fix that. And you're going to, like, all you have to do is keep doing everything you can to get as many small edges as possible, and then one day it might go your way. But also, it might never go your way, which is also why being results-oriented, which we spoke about probably a million times in this podcast, is just the biggest trap. Like, you got to enjoy the journey. You got to realize that you're not playing this game ultimately. Like, the plus EV mindset is just, I don't think it will ultimately lead to happiness and fulfillment. And you're here to sort of experience, you're traveling the world, right? You got to go to Lille, you get to travel, you get to be with your friends, you get to play games, right? That's a great experience, right? So it didn't go your way, but you can learn a lesson from this. And we have one literally in the sentence, travel difficulties. Just fix that. Even if some of it was out of your hand, just try to make it as much in your hands next time as possible. Fix all that, and you're setting yourself up better for next time. And yeah, that's just how these things go. There is a bit of a luck aspect, but there's also sometimes you're just going to lose, and you might lose many, many times in a row before you eventually win. And that's just how it goes. Unless you're Michael Hamilton, then you just win all the time.
Apparently. Yeah. I just want to reiterate a couple of points you just made, Brendan, because I think they're actually phenomenal points. This idea of, like, plus EV, don't play a card game, to be honest, if that's what you're looking for, would be my advice.
Yeah.
If you're looking at it from a purely value standpoint. And just reiterating back, like you say, we've talked about it many times, but the process and not the results orientation. I do think when it comes to the results, you do need to reflect back on some of those and have the takeaways from that, but they can't be the be all and end all. I just don't think you can enjoy the game that way. I mean, maybe you can, and that's cool. Maybe you can if it's purely results orientated, but it's probably because you're winning on a streak, and then when the gold streak comes, it's going to hurt. And pairings are a thing, a little bit of variance is a thing. It's not all just about the work and the choices and the preparation.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I'm definitely not saying this was you for the original ask of this question, but we have somebody sort of loosely in our group that doesn't deal with losses well at all, especially on the day. His name is Dante Del Frisco, and Dante will always come after his losses and talk about his bad beat story, how he got so unlucky, et cetera, et cetera. And me and Sasha and I was like, oh, Dante, you felt, you deserve to win. You're entitled to that win. Oh, it's your win. Like, it's like his divine right to have that win. Absolutely not. And when you start thinking about it, like, it's ridiculous, right? Like, sometimes you're going to get unlucky, but that person, the other player on the other side of the board, sat down at the same table, played the same match, and it just turned out that they won, and that's how it's going to go. I think that feeling entitled to the win is just like one of the biggest traps. And I remember when someone first put it that way to me, they were like, "Oh, did you feel entitled to that win?" I was just like, "Wow."
Feel that way. Right?
I was like, wow, that's a really stupid way of thinking, right? Like, I should never think that way. And I think it was actually Steven from Team Covenant who was asking. So he's like, "Oh, you felt entitled to that win?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah,
and
nah."
You pushed some people under the bus this morning.
Oh yeah, I mean, Dante, the infinite salt mine. He always gets it. All right, so Hayden, we got one more here. It's from I think is it Michael or Michelle? I don't know. I think it's Michael, but it's spelled a bit differently. This is on YouTube. He said, "Command and Cookout question here," but rolls into the mailbag. "From what I heard, LSS wants to focus more on existing classes and talents next year. Should the focus be on talents mixing with classes that wouldn't naturally mix? For example, Draconic Guardian, go tall versus go wide, or the focus on those that would? Things like, Earth Brute, the big attacks, stuff like that. Or maybe Ice Brood, like a Yeti or something." How do you think that these sort of talents are expanded into the current hero pool? Do you think it's stuff that's more thematic, or are we going to see, like, do you think that Lightning Brute would be a good idea? Like, how crazy do you want it to be?
First of all, I think I just looked down at this. This is from Mikkel. I think what they've done so far with trying to keep it somewhat in line with, first of all, I think lore-wise it has to fit, right? So, I look at Bravo's style of the show and the essence of Arya and Earth Lightning. That makes sense to me, right? I think if you start to move away from that, like a Lightning Brute, what's the origin of that? I'd like to know about. I think initially I would like to see it probably work within the pie of what we have so far. So it expand on what they are already, extend some of the strategies, introduce a couple of new strategies by virtue of having something that's similar but fits in with that hero already, rather than just going super crazy with it. We used to start to see clashes of, lore, theory, game fundamentals of what we're seeing from Flesh and Blood so far. Not to say that I wouldn't want to see that in the future. The Ice Brute, a Yeti hero, for instance. Like, I think that could work, but you need to have the setup for those things first. And I think I would like to probably just see a little bit of expansion of what we already know. So something like you look at this Royal Draconic Warrior Wizard. What else is the subtype there? That's interesting, because it's like, okay, where does the line between warrior and wizard come into it? Like, what does that look like? Don't quite know yet. And then you think about Draconic as well. I was like, wow, there's an extra spin on that. So when I actually saw that card revealed, I was like, huh, okay. And then I kind of just walked away and thought, I don't think I like that from a design standpoint. But I'm interested to see what actually comes out of it with Dynasty. I am really interested to see a bit more of of just like, I guess the Draconic thing gives you a bit of a, if you just mash two classes together, all of a sudden you've doubled the card pool.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Do you think that?
Right.
Yeah, my quick interjection is like, and you can answer this after. And I'm sorry that I have this flaw in my personality to just interject thoughts that come into my mind. But do you think that dual classes could actually exist in class constructed heroes? I don't think so. Like, I think it would just immediately be broken.
It seems to, yeah, right. And so I'm also talking around circles a little bit because I'm thinking about this as we go, but yeah, I think it's too much, right? So Draconic, even so far we've seen the Emperor be young, presumably maybe Emperor's also got an adult version, but the Draconic limits the card pool, right? So you go, oh, look, doubling of card pool, Warrior and Wizard, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, Draconic, bring it back, right? can only have red cards in the deck. So you immediately cut the pool down, but you give access to a different slice than, say, Dorinthia sees, or say Kano sees, a different slice, but it's still a slice that's kind of somewhere around the same amount of cards, which is really interesting. So I don't think you could have straight up. I think you need restrictions, right?
Yeah,
I think you definitely couldn't touch on, say, Shadow, Light plus dual class like that. Now you're starting to get into some dangerous territory, I think, potentially. So
you just look at the hero card and you got to read a paragraph as the subtext. It's just I think I think dual class, like, I think it's a really dangerous area of design, but dual classes with a deck building restraint printed on the card could be cool, right? It could be really cool. But we'll have to see, and that might be the direction that they go. I kind of doubt it, just because I feel like it'd be so dangerous for balance. But LSS has proven that they're willing to test that line. No, just kidding.
Push the boundaries. Remember when we first learned about things like Soul, right? It's like, this makes no sense. You have to put these cards like under your hero, and now it's like, yeah, Soul. Like, what's wrong with that? That's a perfectly normal mechanic. There's these things that we get introduced to and we go, well, that's not really going to work, is it? And then it's tested. It's part of a grand sort of idea of what the game can be in a realization. So, I expect to see it work. I had a thought, maybe you start to print restrictions on the card itself. Then you're just reading a novel, which is really tough and it's really hard to understand. So I think this idea of, like an extra subtype is, as a way of restricting things, could be the most probable way that we see initial dual class heroes be balanced.
Yeah, just a small anecdote before we close out. In terms of design like that, I remember traps in Arcane Rising. Before we kind of understood Arcane Rising, they looked pretty good. In Welcome to Wraith, defense reactions were super powerful. It was like, wow, Ranger's gonna get additional defense reactions. I was pretty hyped. Or was that just, did they only get traps in Crucible?
Yeah,
I can't remember. Yeah, so that's what I mean in Crucible. So we had a bit of dash and stuff. Sorry, it gets all mashed up because that was COVID and Arcane Rising for at least US players wasn't really a format. But I remember seeing the traps and I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. Command and Conquer wasn't the format, but at least in the heavy D-React format, it looked kind of good. And then you saw the execution of traps just kind of flop. And it's kind of where I think they are until we get a new Ranger printed. Nevertheless, that is quite the quite the tangent. Hayden, why don't you close us off for the week, sir?
Yeah, I think we've got no review this week, but if you do want to submit your reviews, we really appreciate it. It does help us get out to more listeners and viewers potentially. So you can go to ratethispodcast.com/Arsenal Pass, leave your review on your preferred podcast platform, and if you want to give us 5 stars, we won't complain. We appreciate it. That's that's it for the mailbag this week. I think some really great questions there. We like doing these episodes because it brings to the forefront what listeners of Arsenal Pass are thinking about and discussing. And so we will continue to do these, periodically. What that period is yet to be determined by us. Probably at least twice a year. We like to do these mailbag episodes as these questions kind of add up, or we really feel like it's a great time to reach out to the community for questions. Good luck to all those competing at national championships this coming weekend and for the next 2 weeks. I think it's going to be a really exciting time to see how this meta develops. I haven't been able to play much, Brendan. I know you've been playing more than me. I just want to leave you with the final question is, what do you think of this potential meta so far and the enjoyability of it? Don't worry about like the balance, etc. The enjoyability of this meta.
It's tough, Hayden. That's a really tough question because the thing is like, I know that you want a simple answer, but I gotta dive into it just a little bit. So in terms of the meta, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because I'm able to play Kano into people that are not my testing partners and not my friends who are going to sit there and have a miserable experience and completely waste their time. And I can just queue it up online. Even things like Icelander that can be pretty miserable for the people sitting on the other side of the board. The fact that I can just play those matchups, the heroes that I really enjoy. Like I said, I was going to take a multi-month break from Flesh and Blood, and I'm having more fun than I've had in a long time, right? It's a great time. I'm loving this meta. I don't know but that's the thing is when you say this meta, I don't know if I'm loving this meta or I'm just loving the state that the game is in because I can play games on demand whenever I want. I can play the decks that I want and I can ultimately kind of just have fun. So I'm having a really good time with Flesh and Blood right now. But I do think that the control meta is going to be, or the control meta, quote unquote, this following meta is going to be a fun one. I do.
Yeah. I want to leave that I want to just add a statement onto that for all of our listeners is that I've had those periods in time as well where I've really enjoyed the game, even though I've thought the meta maybe hasn't been amazing. And a big part of that has been enjoying my sort of like playing in armories and skirmishes and things like that. And, I know there's a lot of discourse right now about Flesh and Blood Online and things like that. I do just want to say, don't forget your locals as well. I do just want to put that out there. All right, Brendan, I'm going to sign it off. If you want to find us on Twitter, we're at Brendan APG, Fian_Dale for myself. Come join Flesh and Blood Twitter. Talk all things sort of, events happening. I'll be tweeting about nationals this weekend. I'm sure, once Brendan's back in country, I'll be tweeting about more Flesh and Blood as well. And other than that, big thank you to all of our patrons.
I've been tweeting tons of Flesh and Blood. Anyway.
That's actually true. I just realized that. Yeah, especially
tweeting
game logs.
Tweeting madman. All right. I'll see y'all next week. Thanks for listening.
See you later.